Hey folks, this is Jason Lewis, the producer of the From the Shadows podcast. I just want to remind you about our website, fromtheshadowspodcast.com. We have a Facebook page. We would appreciate it if you like and follow. Also, join our discussion group on Facebook called After the Shadows. We have a Twitter feed. Please follow us on Twitter. It can be found with @podcast_from. Follow us on Instagram at From the Shadows Podcast. We have a YouTube channel. Go to the search bar at YouTube and put From the Shadows Podcast, and please subscribe to that channel. We are also on the Odyssey Radio Network, and we can be found there at odyssey1.com. We're still on the traditional podcatchers that everybody loves to listen to us on. We get a lot of feedback, so please rate the podcast and communicate with whether you're on Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn, Apple Podcasts, Podbean, or Google Podcasts. We're there, and we appreciate it when you leave comments for us. We also have a Patreon page. It can be found at www.patreon.com/From the Shadows. You can receive books, stickers, coffee mugs, and special content just for our Patreon subscribers. Check it out for yourself and see what packages that we have to offer. Well, that's all I have for you right now, folks, and thanks for being a part of the From the Shadows podcast family. So with that being said, let's get this episode started.
Hey, welcome everyone to this episode of the From the Shadows podcast. I'm your host, Shane Grove, and joining me deep in the bowels of the From the Shadows podcast studios is the Judge.
Good morning, everyone.
We're waiting for everyone to repeat good morning. We don't hear them. And somewhere in Central Ohio is Jason, the super producer. Jason, what's happening this morning?
Greetings. I'm doing well. It's rainy over here where I'm at.
It's raining here too as well. But we're excited this morning because we have a prolific author, and I do say prolific, of as the Judge describes, the quintessential
bathroom reader,
Jason Offutt. Did I pronounce that right?
Yep, you got it.
All right.
So we're really excited to have Jason on. I purchased Jason's book, Chasing American Monsters, over 250 creatures, cryptids, and hairy beasts. It really is the quintessential bathroom reader. It sits either on top or on bottom sometimes with Ken Gerhardt's book. And it's
the Judge didn't tell me that it was his bathroom reader until after I had picked it up and was checking out.
Hey, listen, just use hand sanitizer, man. We live in an era of COVID. Always have hand sanitizer. But no, Jason, I'm super excited to have him on today. I picked up his book a while back, and for anyone out there who's interested in cryptids, creatures, monsters, this is a must-have book because it breaks down every state by state, alphabetical order, and it highlights, the main cryptid or monsters from each state. So it's a really cool, quick reader. Go out, pick it up if you haven't. I love the book. Like I said, it sits right there with Ken Gerhardt, Nick Redford's books.
But before we really dig into some of the stories in the book, Judge, the reason that we contacted Jason was
I saw Jason on TV. I can't remember whether it was Monsters in America or Terror in the Woods, one of those shows, and a fascinating story about a cryptid. I wouldn't call it a cryptid. A fascinating creature that we've never talked about on our show that gets very little airtime, but is really, really super creepy and cool. And that is the evil gnome. So, Jason, you got involved in a story out of California involving an evil gnome. You want to tell our listeners how you got involved and how it all, and the cool part is how all the dots connect. It really freaked me out.
Yeah, the connected party, and it was Monsters and Mysteries in America that had that segment about the gnomes. Yeah, I was contacted by a woman named Tammy, who had this story, and it was like, yeah, this is a great, crazy story, and it got more validity to it as it went on. But her story was she moved her and her children. She had 2 daughters and a young son to a house outside. Out in the country by a river in California, the Tool River, and I think I'm pronouncing that right.
We got your last name right. That's all we're cared about.
That's all I care about, right? Yeah, let's go with that. My last name. Anyway, it was nice that there was a shed on the property along. I mean, it was a two-story house, an older farmhouse. There was a shed on the property. There was a barn. And, the river was right there, so they could go walk down to the river and fish or skip stones or whatever. But there was something kind of off about the shed on the property. It gave Tammy and her kids the creeps. Their dog and cats tended to avoid it. Whenever they walked anywhere near it, they would, the animals would take a wide berth. And they just, they really didn't know what to think about it. They also had some chickens and ducks, and those things started disappearing, and they weren't sure why. They thought maybe coyotes. But then one day, Tammy'd gone to the grocery store with her son. Her 2 daughters were at home, and when she was unloading the car, she heard a chuckle, and she looked up, and standing by the shed was a little man about, I don't know, 2.5 feet tall. And it was a typical, coffee table book gnome. With gnomes standing out, in the garden.
With the red hat sticking up and all that stuff?
Yep, red hat sticking up,
They weren't
white
filming
beard.
a Velocity commercial, were they?
No.
Okay.
The red pointed hat, the beard, gold tunic, and brown pants. It wasn't wearing any shoes, but this thing was staring at her and chuckling this evil laugh, and of course it scared the hell out of her. And she left the groceries, grabbed her kid, and ran into the house, and shut the door. And her daughters were like, well, what's going on? And she's like, get down, duck, duck, duck. So they all ducked in the kitchen, and then they heard something outside, and they saw the gnome's pointed hat in the window of the kitchen, and it went from window to window to window until it was gone. And the one of the weird things was that those windows were about 10 feet off the ground. And
what?
Right. So
either the gnome was levitating or had a very large hat.
Something like that. And they were terrorized for a while. They didn't see it again, but they would hear its laugh, and little mischievous things would happen. And finally they'd had it. Tammy had had enough, and she left. I thought that was the end of the story, and until a woman, she went by Charlie. She read my story. It's funny because the name of your show is the name of a paranormal newspaper column that I wrote for about 5 years called "It Was From the Shadows."
Wow.
Yeah. And that's where the gnome story first appeared. And when it when it was online, this woman named Charlie read it, and she was like, "Oh my God, this happened to me." So she contacted me and related to me the story of her and her husband. She was pregnant, and her and her husband moved to this farmhouse out in the country. The Tool River was going, was right through the property. There was a shed and a barn on the property, and she was like, "This is just so similar," and they started having these problems too. They started, they had a couple of dogs that were spooked by this shed. The shed creeped everybody out. a couple of things happened. One was they heard a screeching coming out of the shed, and she went to investigate, and she found a cat that was still alive, but had been in a hell of a fight, and it was missing its hindquarters. So she called for her husband, and for her husband to come, because she was not going in the shed. And her husband came out, and he's like, "Okay, something happened. I've got to put this out of its misery and bury it." And they left and got a shovel and came back. She didn't want to stand by that shit by herself. And when they came back, the cat was gone, and there was no way it could have moved itself. And then other little things after she had her babies, little things, kept happening. Things started missing, disappearing outside. They put a koi pond in, and the koi kept disappearing. And they thought it was raccoons or something, so they put a light up, motion sensor light. And one night the motion sensor light popped on, and Tammy and her husband looked out, and there was a little man standing out by the koi pond. He had, just what, just like Tammy had said, Charlie and her husband saw. He was wearing a red conical hat, gold tunic, brown pants. He had a beard, and he was about 2 to 3 feet tall. And he was holding one of their fish. And it looked up at them and saw them looking at it, and it grinned really big and bit the head off of the fish. And they freaked out and called the police. They called the local sheriff. They didn't tell the local sheriff there was a gnome outside eating their koi, but they said that there was, a trespasser on the property, and the cops came out and looked around, and they didn't see anything except footprints from what looked like, I don't know, about an 8 to 9 year old kid, about that size, were all around the koi pond. Again, they didn't say anything about the gnome. They later took all the rest of the fish, and they had they had like little stone pieces of art out there, like a frog and a gnome, which is funny. And they took all that stuff inside. They put the fish in a in a tank, and one night they heard screaming, and the light came on, and they looked outside and they saw this gnome, and he was standing by the empty pond just screaming, and then he ran toward the house, and this freaked them out. They lived out in the country, so they often left their doors unlocked, and they ran downstairs to lock the doors. And the gnome, it sounded like it was running around the house really fast, and it was screeching the whole way. And then all of a sudden, Charlie's husband remembered the dog door, and he rushed into the kitchen just as the door was starting to pull open, and he kicked it, and the thing screeched, and he was able to throw the bolt down on the door so it couldn't get in. But
so
they moved
crawl
very
through the
quick.
doggy door.
Yeah, it was trying to crawl through the doggy door, and they moved quickly after that. These two cases were way too similar to not be connected. So I put these two women together. I put them in contact with each other, and they went out, and they'd lived in this. It was the same house.
It was
the same house.
Oh my God.
It was the same house. They lived in the same house. It was the same gnome. The woman who lived in the house at that point didn't want to talk to them, but they looked around the property, and the only thing really different was the shed had been torn down. They went. There were a few other houses in the area they went to, and nobody knew anything. They weren't going to talk, but there was an old woman who lived in a trailer, really, about a half a mile away from the house, and she said that she's been, animals have been messing with the house and getting in, and one of them took a crap on her in the middle of her living room. They don't know if it's the gnome or not, but yeah, it might be.
Oh. Well, normally an animal doesn't break into a trailer to go take a
defecate. unless it happened to have a copy of the quintessential
bathroom reader on the coffee.
Right.
So Jason, I mean, when you hear this, were you intrigued enough to say, listen, I want the address of this house because I want to go out there and do a stakeout and see if I can see this gnome?
You know what? I would if I lived in California, but Missouri to California is a hell of a drive. I wasn't going to do that.
Haven't you?
Yes, I have heard of airplanes. But I'm also I'm a teacher by day. So
okay.
Yeah.
Hey kids, we're gonna take this real creepy field trip. Some of you may not
climb on the bus.
I did take. Well, I teach at a university. I did take a group of students on a field trip to the Villisca, Iowa axe murder house once. You know, it was the best field trip ever.
Oh man, bet you're the best teacher ever, as far as I'm concerned. I mean,
darn straight.
So how? Well, okay, so back to the gnome story though. So is that the end of it? Like they figured out it was the same house and that's it. Nobody wanted to talk. Nobody investigated, or
right at that point that was it. I did go, you know, to the extent of looking up, you know, doing some research on gnomes, and I mean it's something that's fairly, creatures of that size are fairly worldwide, not necessarily with the conical hat and everything.
Yeah.
Although a professor I interviewed, I'm trying to remember what university. This has been a few years ago, but he's an expert on Scandinavian mythology because his family came from Sweden. His grandma still lives in Sweden, and he said that his grandma would still leave milk out at night for the tomtars. The tomtar is the name of gnomes in Sweden. And she was worried that if she didn't leave, you know, milk out, which was a present for them, that, you know, that they would, you know, do mischief, like tie the cows' tails together, or, you know, kill the car battery or whatnot. And I mean, these are stories throughout Europe about that specific entity, and in different cultures they leave beer out for them or food. Still, because they're, you know, generally concerned about the gnomes.
Well, it's obvious listening to these ladies' stories that they're not very hospitable little creatures. I mean, he seemingly was mad that his easy food source of the koi pond was gone, you know.
And I think, Jason, if I remember correctly, I read an article that you'd put on in the publication about this, and correct me if I'm wrong on this. Didn't the gnome shoot the second lady the middle finger?
Oh yeah, I'd forgotten about that. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right.
So, I mean, what's interesting about that is a couple things. One is they both saw the same thing. So I'm thoroughly convinced they both saw the same creature, this gnome. If this was one single person, say, hey, listen, you know, I saw this gnome, he gave me the middle finger, I'd be like, this person's on shrooms or meth. But the fact that they both saw the same creature, described it the same way, the clothes were the same way.
It did not know they were at the same house.
It did not know they were at the same house, convinces me in a court of law, I guess, that this thing's real. So I guess the question, to beg the question, these things obviously would know that a middle finger, the universal salute, it was an insult. You know what I'm saying? So how intelligent are these things that they would know our social mores to understand that giving someone the middle finger is an insult?
But yet dress in such
but dress, I mean, what
awful
actually
way with a red pointed. I mean, that's just terrible.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's
current in their dress.
Right. Well, I mean, if these things are real, and I'm going to take a step back to something else that you said that I agree with completely with with the first lady telling me this story, I'm like, yeah, this is a fun story. The second person talking to me, I'm like, wait a second, there is something to this. All right, but if these things exist, they apparently exist around us. And if they exist around us, someplace that we can't, readily see them, who knows how many are watching us? And if they're watching us, they learn things.
Well, the other thing is, how old are these things? You know what I mean? So we actually have a following from Iceland
And Sweden.
Denmark,
Norway.
So our Icelandic and Swedish and Scandinavian, European listeners out there, if you're listeners, shoot us an email or get a hold of Grover and tell us some cool stories. Because, we've done a little bit of research on the Fae and different things like that. And I guess the question is, how old do these things get? I mean, are these things 300, 400, 500 years old? I mean, do they have a normal lifespan? And how did this one particular gnome end up in California? I mean, obviously, he could have gotten a shipping crate. I mean, who knows?
Well, I've heard, and Jason, in doing research, because I'm an avid listener to the Sasquatch Chronicles, and Wes has had a couple Native Americans on there telling stories about the Native Americans' experiences with what they call little people and how they're pranksters and pulling jokes and tricks and like the same thing, pulling their car battery cables out and hiding their keys and doing stuff. And they know they exist. They've existed as long as there's been Native Americans in our land. So have you run across any of those stories, and do any of them seem similar in nature as to what these people in California experience?
Oh, well, yes. Not exactly to the ones in California, but to go back to something I said earlier about these stories being all over the place. I mean, in Iceland, you mentioned Iceland. There's a long tradition of elves, and boulder fields are apparently a place where they live, and there are cases to where they won't build a road through where they think elves live. They won't build a house on a spot where they believe elves live because they don't want to offend these creatures. I mean, that's to this day. There are little people stories all over the planet. The ones in the Native American stories I find particularly interesting because we have, I'm trying to remember the name,
we have the Pukwudgies.
So many. That's where I was going. The Pukwudgies. All right, Pukwudgies. Thank you. Pukwudgies are about the same height as this gnome, around 2 to 3 feet tall. They have bows and arrows. They are mischievous. They will lead people through the woods, possibly over a cliff. They will help people if the people are worthy. They can turn invisible and start random fires. And the arrows that they shoot are poison. All of those things I just mentioned are important because almost the exact same story of little people is spread across the United States, spread across North America. I mean, there are stories of little people like this in the upper Midwest, in Idaho, in Utah. They go by different names, and sometimes the arrows are magic arrows as opposed to poison arrows, but they're the same size. They have the same abilities, the invisible, the fire. How the heck did these stories get from the east all the way out to the west if there's not something to them? Again, throughout Europe, well, let's talk about, and this is one of those cases. It really ticks me off when I'm scientific minded by nature, but it ticks me off when science ignores things that the indigenous people say, just because they think they're superstitious. Let's look to Indonesia. there was long-standing stories of what was called the Ibu Gogo, which means grandmother who'll eat anything. And the stories were of diminutive people who would sneak into villages and, steal children and eat them. And apparently on the Flores Island in Indonesia, these Ibu Gogo lived in a cave. And at one point, the villagers went and killed all of them. Okay, yeah, great fun story, says science, until scientists actually discovered a cave where these skeletons of 2 to 3 foot, or they were like 3 foot tall humans were. And they determined the 3 foot tall humans weren't children. They were fully grown adults, and this is how tall they grew. So, and they were dubbed the hobbits. They're a new, type of Homo sapien. All right, that was solidified by science on a local legend about little people. I mean, how many more of these legends across the world can be proven if we just look hard enough?
Well, it's the same thing as the giant squid, and there's a great story about excuse me. There's a great story about the sinking of the Lusitania, where the German U-boat sunk the Lusitania, which got us into the World War, and survivors that were floating in the water described a giant squid had came up and were taking some of the survivors under the water, and not a single newspaper would run that story. They omitted every bit of that because, well, that's just fairy tales, folklore. It's stories that sailors told their kids. And so no publication would print that. Well, you fast forward, 60, 70 years, and lo and behold, we find out, oh, wow, we actually found a carcass of a giant squid. They really do exist. And so the mere fact that science doesn't believe that something isn't real doesn't mean that it isn't real. And so we come full circle, whether you're talking about gnomes or Sasquatch or dogmen or anything like that. The mere fact that we don't have a body in and of itself does not make something not real.
Right, and there are cases like that spread throughout history. I mean, the giant panda was thought to be a myth by Western science until we actually saw one. The same with the mountain gorilla. There were stories of a creature that was part zebra, part giraffe, and in the Congo, and that sounded crazy until the okapi was seen by Western science, and I mean these were in the 20th centuries when that happened.
Yeah, I was going to say that all those discoveries have been within the last 100, 150 years.
Yeah. What is more likely, that there's a Homo sapien that's about 3 foot tall that has existed for hundreds of thousands of years, or a horse that has a 12-foot long neck? And I mean, you start looking at stuff from a zoological standpoint, and you say, look, it's really not a far stretch that there is a 8 to 10 foot bipedal ape-like creature that's roaming the forests and whatever the world. When you look at a giraffe, and you think to yourself, what in the hell is the odds that is a creature that has somehow made it through natural selection? You know what I mean?
It doesn't even make sense.
It doesn't even make sense.
Oh, geez, let's not even talk about the giraffe. Let's go with the platypus. I mean, that's the obvious one.
Yeah.
Where the hell did that thing come from?
Exactly.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely.
It was a wild Saturday night somewhere.
Yeah. Well, whenever the British scientists were first down in Australia, and they, and a naturalist sent stuffed a platypus and sent it back to London, the people in London thought it was a joke. They thought that they were sent a beaver that had been fitted with a duck's bill. They didn't, until they saw a live one, they didn't believe it. Yeah, there's another case. There's a case from Africa that I really like to bring up. this whole the indigenous people knowing knowing things and Western science not, has to do with the Congo in the Billy Forest, Bili. That the locals had told Westerners about these enormous chimpanzees that would sometimes walk on two legs, howl at the moon, and they were capable of killing and eating leopards. And they also, acted like gorillas at times. And, it's a cute story until I think it was 96, it might have been 98, when science discovered the billy ape, which was an enormous chimpanzee that makes nests like a gorilla.
Yeah, I think Joe Rogan had that on his podcast, believe it or not.
Yeah, well, and
they call them lion killers.
Well, why, if this is real, that we found out this was real, are all these Sasquatch stories discounted? And
especially if that's something that's not even 20 years ago or 25 years ago that those things have been proven to exist, right?
Right, absolutely.
Yeah.
But let's look. Exactly. I think just to me on circumstantial evidence, that to me there's really no doubt that Sasquatch is out there, because if we're to believe what science tells us, or historians tell us, that at one point the world's oceans were barriers. I personally don't believe that, but if the world's oceans were barriers, then the continents really didn't have that much contact with each other. So if that's the case, how come every continent has stories of Sasquatch? I mean, even Australia, for God's sake, they've got the Yowie, which is basically a really pissed off American Sasquatch.
But that's sort of typical for Australians in general. They're mad about something.
Yeah, well, don't mess with Australians. But I mean, there's stories throughout Asia. We've got the Yeren from China. We've got the Alma from Russia. The wild man of the forest from Europe. Of course, the Sasquatch. We've got stories of small, smaller ape men in South America. Then there's the orang pindak from Borneo in that area. I mean, why are all these stories around through all these indigenous cultures if there's not something to it?
Well, the interesting thing that I find about it is, like Native American cave drawings and things like that. Native Americans drew what they saw. And you look at some of these cave drawings, and there's buffalo, there's antelope, there's, fox, deer, and then Sasquatch. You know what I mean? It's like, okay, well, we know for certain 5 of the 6 exist on the Great Plains, okay? So why not the 6th? And the thing is, so being a judge, and I'm actually a real judge, Jason didn't know that, and I was a trial lawyer for 17 years, tried, very, very serious criminal cases and some civil cases. And the thing about the law is that the law is way ahead of science. I know this sounds funny, right? But the law is much further ahead than science, because in the law, you have 2 types of evidence. You have direct evidence and you have circumstantial evidence. And in a jury trial, I instruct a jury that circumstantial evidence is just as powerful as direct evidence, that you are allowed to consider circumstantial evidence just as if it's direct evidence. And the silly story that we always usually tell juries is that, if you come downstairs in the middle of the night and you find your child has, you had the last piece of blueberry pie is in the refrigerator, and you come downstairs and you see a blueberry stain on the kid's chin and shirt, you didn't actually have to see him eat the pie. You don't actually have to see them do it.
Yeah.
And so when you look at circumstantial evidence, one, the gnome stories are direct evidence. These are eyewitnesses. I saw it, whatever. But you just look at the circumstantial evidence around a lot of these cryptids and creatures and things like that. It's overwhelming.
Well, like just to somebody coming back with the cast of a 18-inch long footprint, that's circumstantial evidence because you didn't see the thing make it.
Right.
Okay.
That's
But
circumstantial.
that's pretty
Yeah, I mean,
direct evidence that there was something that stepped,
Right. Now,
Yeah, that's
but
what I'm
now,
saying.
Well, and especially when you have forensic scientists who look at the dermal ridges on the foot and say, this came from something real. It looks like, a primate would make it, primates including us too, but it's not human. Because there have been those who've done that.
Yeah. Well, I was watching one of the Finding Bigfoots one time, and Cliff was looking at a print. And one thing that he said that stuck out to me was that he knew that the print was made by a biological creature by the way the little toe on the 1 foot stuck out, because you could not fake that if you tried to put a board together and try to stamp it, because the way the little toe on the 1 foot rolled, you know what I mean? You could tell that there was from a kinesiology standpoint that thing, walked and it rolled its foot as it did it. And if you were trying to stamp things and fake it, that's just something it would be impossible to fake. That is really powerful circumstantial evidence that something made that print. And then you take into the howls and stuff like that. So coming full circle back to the gnome situation, anything else with that story, the original story we were talking about between those two people, or is that how the trail went cold, shall we say?
That's when Tammy and Charlie got together and drove out to where they had lived, and of course at separate times. That was it. That's the end of the story as I know it.
So it makes me wonder. You said that whoever the current resident of the house was when they got there, did not want to talk to him. Did they not want to talk to him because they had similar experiences and they didn't want to be thought of as crazy, or they thought these people were crazy and didn't want anything to do with them? And the shed being torn down, was the shed the genesis of how the gnome, where it lived, how it traveled to this dimension, if it's in another dimension, or was it its portal and the shed getting torn down? Maybe that just kind of did away with any gnome activity.
That's generally how I've been thinking of it. Yeah, once the shed was torn down, the thing had gone. One of the earlier questions somebody had asked was how did it get here? If these things are European, how did it wind up over here? One of the things that I've come to the conclusion to people, whenever they travel, whenever they relocate from one continent to the other, they don't just bring themselves and their family and, their photo albums or whatever. They bring their monsters with them. The Banshee is an Irish legend, and there are Banshee stories in South Dakota. The Tommyknockers are from that's a Cornwall, England, specifically a minor story of the Tommyknockers, and they didn't appear in the United States. We didn't have Tommyknocker stories until Pennsylvania coal mines hired Cornish miners to come over and mine, because apparently they were the best in the world. And then all of a sudden we had Tommyknocker stories in Pennsylvania. And when these miners went to California for the gold rush, we had Tommyknocker stories in California. So either people unwittingly...
Real quickly, for our listeners, tell us what a Tommyknocker is.
Okay, yeah, sorry. Tommyknockers are little people, more little people. The Cornish legend is that they are the souls of the Jewish people who betrayed Jesus. I don't know where that comes from, but that's their origin story. What they appear as is little miners, about 2 to 3 feet tall. They're dressed like miners, and they mine, and they also they will do things mischievous, like they will steal lunches. They will take tools and, maybe a week later bring them back. So they do mischievous things like that, but they will also apparently warn miners if there's going to be a cave-in.
Gotcha.
So yeah, that's what a Tommyknocker is. So if miners were to go down into the mine and down one passage, hear some knocking that shouldn't be there, to them that's the Tommyknockers telling them not to go down that passage today. And so yeah, that's what the Tommyknockers are. But again, it's somebody coming from a different culture over to the United States and bringing their stories of monsters here. Whether that's just stories or whether that be, the monsters latching on and coming over with them, or something that I've been thinking a lot lately, is that maybe all these monsters and paranormal entities are the same things, and by that I mean there might be energies out there that will appear to people as whatever the people believe. If that makes any sense. For example, if you put a lot of mental energy into something, if you're talking about a specific entity a lot, more will start to appear. This happened with Slender Man, because it's completely fictitious. It was made up for a contest, a creepypasta contest, and all of a sudden, I talked to some people who were dead serious that they saw this entity at a park or out in the woods, and they were serious about it. And I'm like, wait a second, but that's made up. Well, if enough energy is put into, thinking about that entity or talking about that entity, something will take its form.
Well, that kind of thought is it goes back to like the original Ghostbusters. Okay, what scares you the most? Is that what's going to appear as your boogeyman, so to speak? And not everybody's going to think of the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man to try to destroy. But think about it, if something unknown, so now of course, what's the odds that these two ladies are scared to death of gnomes, except for the fact that maybe there's a gnome, the gnome statue. But what if there's something out there and that's what you would put to it? It's an evil, like, it's evil, it's scary, it's not good. And all of a sudden you're like, oh my God, if it's evil, the only thing I'm scared of is gnomes. Or I'm scared of, it's like people they see a Bigfoot and they try to put a bear label on it. Like it's a crazy looking bear. You only know what boxes that and you're trying to put stuff in boxes. What if, that's what you're most fearful of, as a ghost or Slender Man.
Well, there's a psychological term out there that they call mass hysteria, and that people inherit mass hysteria, that it gets passed down through your genetic code, and that people aren't really seeing Bigfoot. This is something, is something, whatever. But from an energy standpoint, I think what Jason's trying to say is that, look, there is this, we know that
we can manifest something.
Look, everything in the universe is just energy. That's all it is. When the universe was created, going back to the singularity, it was white hot, just pure energy. And the only reason why we actually have physical matter in this world is because when in the Big Bang, when things started to cool down, elements started to form, and that's how we actually came up with iron, is that stars burned so hot that they eventually developed an iron core. When that iron core basically compressed it, stars would explode, and so everything is just energy. And you start thinking, well, okay, energy can take many forms, it can manifest in different ways.
And can we subconsciously manifest
Correct.
something?
Can we subconsciously take that energy? Because energy, obviously we've talked about this first rule of thermodynamics, energy cannot be created nor destroyed. It just takes different forms, takes different shapes. Are we able to psychologically have energy manifests itself into these different things? And do these things have some sort of self-conscious or not? Interesting thought, Jason. That's an interesting one to throw out there.
Well, yeah, and yes, thanks for putting it in those terms. I wasn't going to go off on that, but you know what? I'm glad you did, because that was eloquent. Well, but let's look at
the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man analogy.
Nothing is better than the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man. But well, when it comes to you mentioned Ghostbusters. Dan Aykroyd, his dad, wrote books on the paranormal. So Aykroyd knew, or knows, he's still around, but Aykroyd knows a lot about the paranormal. So when he and Harold Ramis wrote the script for Ghostbusters, a lot of that was
isn't his
spot
grandfather,
on.
His grandparents were like some of the first, like real, truly paranormal investigators, right? It wasn't his dad; it was his grandparents, and then his. It
was his grandparents. Okay, I got that.
I think it started with his grandparents and went on down through. I believe because I've heard him tell Men in Black stories that he's had, which was a very interesting, completely off topic, but he was going to do it was either a movie or a documentary on a famous alien, like UFO, and then all of a sudden as he came out of the meeting, he saw Men in Black across the street, like following him. So he's very interesting character for sure when it comes to the paranormal.
So, James, let me ask you this: unless you want to keep on with this sort of topic,
Well, if I could just, I had one more point about this. It has to do with shadow people and black-eyed kids, and I saw shadow people when I was young, and nobody else that I knew had ever talked about them until the 90s when Art Bell started talking about them. But from the 90s till till now, really, more and more people have talked about shadow people. Black-eyed kids. Brian Bethel, a journalist from Texas, first reported seeing black-eyed kids. I think it was 1998, and then it kind of exploded, and people were seeing them all over the world. Which it makes me wonder if these two types of entities are just taking shape because of all the thought, all the energy, all the discussion people have had about them. The more people talked about them, the more they started showing up. Just saying those
on that. So there's a creature from Louisiana folklore, and I might just totally mispronounce this, and if I do, all of our Cajun listeners out there, feel free to correct me on this. There's a creature called paranormal. You familiar with this one, Jason?
No, it doesn't ring a bell.
So paranormal is this legend of this creature from the swamp, and it will manifest itself in the image of a person that you trust the most to lure you in. Okay, so you're out in the swamp, and and there you see your grandmother out there, and she's like, "Oh, sweetie, come
Which
here."
makes no sense.
Which would make no sense, but this is the person you trust the most. You know what I mean? And so I bring that up because if there is something out there, an energy source that can interpret your thoughts, your emotions,
we're all screwed,
and then manifest itself into a physical form of someone that you would trust the most, then your theory that these things are manifesting because we are giving them power, because we're giving them that energy, sort of makes sense to me. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and there's stories like that of, people being, lost in the woods, and all of a sudden they hear dad yelling my name, or my best buddy yelling my name. But why they're not supposed to be here? Are they looking for me? I'd better go toward the voice. Those sort of things, or babies crying in the woods for no apparent reason. Those type of things are, designed to get us, put us in a vulnerable position. So I guess my suggestion is nobody go in the woods. I guess that's it.
So I've got two questions I definitely want to have you answer. And I think you kind of maybe started by saying that you saw shadow people. Like, what started you on this path to, writing the book Chasing American Monsters, to having a column that you totally ripped off our name from the shadows from?
Right.
And then
Even though you do predate us.
I started my column in 2005, I think.
Those are just,
you got to realize something, though. Time's not linear.
Yeah.
So
in doing all this research and writing, what would be the one thing that you, if this is true, if what we're talking about is the way it is, what is the one thing you would desperately not want to see manifested in your life that would totally scare you? What's your Stay Puft Marshmallow, or the antithesis of this?
Absolutely. There was a great movie. I don't know if you saw it. You guys remember the movie Sphere?
Yeah.
With Samuel L. Jackson, Dustin Hoffman.
Yeah.
That was sort of.
It was a book written by Michael Crichton. Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah.
Remember, that's what they were doing. They were manifesting what they feared most. So back to Grover's question is, Jason, what would be your biggest fear manifested from all the research that you've done since you've written a book that describes over 250?
It describes over 250 of people's worst fears.
Yes.
Okay, my flip answer is to see a clown walking through my hallway in the dark.
We can arrange that, by the way.
Yeah, Wrinkles the Clown. Remember that documentary?
Yeah, that was
Chris Hahn.
Was it Boris? I think it was Boris Karloff. I could be wrong, but I think it was Karloff who said there's nothing more frightening than a clown at midnight, which is pretty accurate. But I think for me, when it comes to all these different types of entities, the one that I would not want to see at my front door would be the black-eyed kids. Those things creep me out the most.
Yeah, that we had Nick Redfern on, and he was telling some great black-eyed kids stories. And the crazy thing is if they did appear at your front door, as long as you don't let them in or invite them in, I think you're safe, right? Isn't that
right?
That's kind of the lore to it. So I got that vampiric lore to it.
Yeah, I'd written quite extensively on black-eyed kids, and I was going to do a book on it. And my wife was like, Jason, all these things that you write about, they don't bother me. Black-eyed kids bother me. So if you write this book and people and black-eyed kids show up at our front door, it's going to be your ass. So I know, where to pick my battles, and that wasn't what I wanted. But
a great prank on Jason would be to show.
It would be a great prank
with the black.
I mean, I don't want to get into how physical my dad was with me, but I was the original black-eyed kid. So but that's
well, the thing. Yeah. The things is not just the creepy factor, but the unknown factor. Again, what happens if you do let them in? I had somebody once tell me maybe these people who die unexpectedly, and the doctors can't, they die at home unexpectedly, and doctors can't figure out why they died. Maybe these people let the black-eyed kids in.
Well, can you imagine if you even had like a hint of trouble when you were living alone, an older person, and one of these things knocked on the door? And it would be terrifying. Wouldn't that be enough? That'd be enough to send you into cardiac arrest right there, seeing.
Right. It definitely would. As I was back working on, like I said, starting to work on the book before I abandoned it, I was contacted by a guy, he definitely could have been yanking my chain, but still, it was pretty creepy. And he claimed to be a black-eyed kid or a black-eyed person, and that their race lives among us, and they are descendants of the serpent from Genesis. And yeah, I handed off this person's contact information and the emails he sent me. I handed all that off to Nick Redfern. I don't think he's done anything with it yet, but he could. Yeah. Nick, yeah, you'd mentioned Nick a couple times. Nick's a great guy.
Yeah. He was a great guest. And so in your research, what's your creepiest black-eyed kid story?
I think this guy emailed him that he's
yeah, that's pretty much it. That's pretty creepy.
That's top that one.
Yeah, I think maybe the creepy one is this mom. She had 3 kids, all of them extremely young. 2 of them were toddlers. They were twins. They were toddlers. The other one was just a few months old. And she got a knock on her door, and she went to it, and there was a little girl about 7 years old, dressed. She was dirty. The dress she was wearing was like 20, 30 years out of date. She had greasy hair, and this girl was like, "Would you please let me in? Somebody's chasing me, and I'm scared. Please let me in." And this girl was talking, just like a normal black-eyed kid encounter, if I can say normal. Like she was, older than what she appeared, and immediately the woman wanted to let her in because here's a kid about 7 or what years old, and she said somebody's chasing her. Of course, she wants to call the police. That's one of the reasons I think these entities appear as children, because if a child is in need, it's our it's our natural instinct to help them. And like a pitcher plant or Venus flytrap, having a sweet scent to gather in the flies.
What I find fascinating about that is that, and I threw that out there, that sort of the vampiric folklore with it, that there is a correlation between vampire lore, that you have to invite them in order to come to your house, and the black-eyed kids. And maybe these things have been around a lot longer than the 1990s, like we think.
Maybe they're an offshoot of certainly. The guy told him they're direct descendants of serpent Genesis.
Well, if we take that guy for his word, absolutely. But you think about it. You think about what vampires are. Vampires drain you of your energy, your essence, right? Blood. And when you look at some of these black-eyed kid stories, people who claim to have had encounters with them, they feel like they've been emotionally drained. They lost time and things like that. So interesting how those two stories somehow mesh a little bit together.
Right. Well, and when it comes to things in the paranormal, and that of course includes everything that I've said. Today it's all just us speculating. We're trying to make sense of something that we might not ever be able to make sense of. All we can do is try to put the pieces together that we have, and when it comes to what you're saying, yeah, right. They definitely overlap with with the vampire lore in a number of different ways that you've spelled out, which also kind of lends credence to what I was saying earlier, that maybe all these things are the same type of entity, the same type of energy that's just appearing as different things.
Well, I'm looking at the cover of your book, Chasing American Monsters, and I'm not sure I want to make sense of what the main goat man is. Yeah.
Right.
Some of these things...
I have a fair share of animal husbandry knowledge, and I got to be honest.
Bestiality,
the goat man there.
But that's just it. Is like some of this stuff. So say that guy calling you or emailing you. What if these things really are direct descendants of the serpent from Genesis? Do we really? Are we when we want to live our lives knowing that these things are
real, or is
real.
ignorance really truly bliss?
Sometimes ignorance really is bliss when it comes to some of this stuff.
Right. Yeah, I want to be put right back in the Matrix, if I know that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Right.
We've talked to some people that basically believe that there's, there's a veil between dimensions, and on one side of the veil is, our daily world, and on the other side of that veil is all these creatures and cryptids and things like that, and that these things are able to cross over into our veil. They pass through because there's all these talk about orbs, people seeing orbs, associated with Bigfoot, Dogman, different things like that, that these things are just energy, that they cross through this energy field into our realm via, orbs and energy. So if that's true, I really don't want to be on the other side of that veil.
Right. I mean, well, and that's something that's been batted around for a while. Famed paranormal investigator John Keel called them window areas, that because a lot of encounters tend to happen in the same place. Like all the Mothman and there's some Goat Man, and what's the other one? There's another entity in West Virginia around Point Pleasant. That would be a window area. A lot of weird things happen in certain parts of Pennsylvania. I don't know if you've had Stan Gordon on before, but he's been researching the paranormal in Pennsylvania since the 60s, and there are spots there. There are places where these things tend to occur. So, I mean, are there a couple of dimensions that overlap? Very well, could be. I mean, that would answer a lot of questions.
Well, you go back to like the whole Midsummer's Night's Eve folklore. This goes back to Iceland, our Scandinavian listeners, that on Midsummer's Night's Eve, the summer solstice, that is when the veil between our realm and the other realm is at its thinnest. It's the same thing with the whole the 3 a.m. And it was interesting because, Jason, that the article you wrote about the gnomes, I noticed that the one lady's first encounter with the gnome was at 3 a.m., which is,
that's the witching hour.
The witching hour, and it is at that time that the veil between our world and the other world is at its thinnest, and things like that. So,
and I do find that and I wanted to mention about the whole gnome thing is that the similarity in the fact that the one people had a cat's rear, the rear bit off the rear end basically of the cat.
Yep.
And then they saw it bite off the head
of a koi.
So, I mean, that's a behavior that, you wouldn't just think, oh, I saw a gnome and it bit off the back end of a cat and it bit off the head of it. I mean, that part of the story, if you're telling a story and you're not a science fiction writer or horror author, that's kind of gruesome to come up for the normal person to just throw out there and
just to make up.
Yeah, to just say,
right.
Oh no, by the way, I can't even imagine. Going into this interview, I never thought we'd be talking about the back end of a cat being bit off. You know what I'm saying? That just kind of is really an abrupt thing to
throw out there.
But Jason, this has been. I think we could continue this conversation for 2 more hours, and it'll be a lot of fun.
Yeah.
But I know it's we got you up early to do this, and we appreciate you coming on. But I want to give you a chance to talk about. You mentioned to us before we went on, you had a new novel come out. So if you want to talk a little bit about some of your new books, some of your old books, where people can go check you out and follow you and see what you're up to next.
All right. Well, yeah, my novel, I'm a smart ass by nature, and generally whenever I write, I put humor in things. There was some of that in Chasing American Monsters. My novel that came out this summer, it's So You Had to Build a Time Machine. It is a humorous look at time travel, and I put it's a lot of fun. It's got quite a bit of good reviews, and it's out there. It's at Barnes and Noble, and it's available on Amazon and fun places like that. Books. I've written 5 books on the paranormal, and two of them I just found out on Friday. The publishing company that put them out is going out of business. So those books within the next few months are not going to be available anymore, but they are right now. One of them is Haunted Missouri, a ghostly guide to the Show Me State's most spirited spots. What I tried to do with that is make a tour guide for haunted places. And every place in the book people can go to. It's not like somebody's private residence. If they want to go experience the ghost themselves, they can. It might cost $15, to get into the Mark Twain's cave, but you can go there. The other one is called What Lurks Beyond, the Paranormal in Your Backyard. For that one, I put a pin in a map at a string that measured out 100 miles, and I drew a circle around my house. And I investigated everything paranormal I could find. And I found mind-reading dog, ghost stories, demon possession, Mike Markham's time machine, if that rings a bell with anybody, a couple of famous UFO cases, and they were all within 100 miles of my house. And, if those things are within 100 miles of my house, those same things are within 100 miles of yours too. So get out there and look. But anyway, those 2 books won't be available anymore after a couple of months.
So if I could get an autographed copy of that, what you're saying is it'll be out of print, it'd be worth a lot of money.
Well, I'm not saying that part, but if it gets you to buy one, I am saying that part.
Well, I think with Christmas coming up, those would be 2 great stocking stuffers, especially for Midwestern people. To get a hold of before they do go out of print, because those sound like some pretty cool books, Especially... Yeah,
it'll be like the novel Escape from New York is out of print, and if you can get it. By the way, just for knowledge, the first novel that I ever read, actual novel, was Escape from New York, Snake Plissken.
Do you have it since it's out of print? Is it
somewhere in a box? And I've tried to buy it. I went on, and yeah, there's people selling them for $300 a copy.
Holy smokes!
Because it's out of print, you can't get it.
Jason,
so maybe
Jason's
might
just
book
want to buy up the remaining inventory and start creating the demand yourself.
Correct.
Online. If this doesn't.
Yes, that's all I can say. I mean, you're doing a great sales pitch for me.
Well, so Jason, how can people, do you have a website? Do you have social media that people can come follow you at and ask you questions? Are you open for people to contact you or not? I mean,
absolutely.
Do you not want us to put your phone number up on our social media? I mean,
you know what? That would be great if you did not put my phone number up.
It's a little late. I put it on the roadside address and said for a good time, call Jason.
Yeah, I've got. Oh boy, will they be disappointed? I've got
really what
a website.
For,
it's jasonoffutt.com. I've got contact information there. I got my email address, and that's about it. No phone number, no mailing address, but there's also links to all my books, and I've got some articles on writing. I've got some science fiction or horror short stories up there. So yeah, if anybody needs to get a hold of me or wants to check out my books, go to jasonoffutt.com.
All right, and we'll put our Jason, the super producer, he'll put a link up in the podcast so that people can go right there to it, and a link to be able to buy your books. So, but we appreciate
awesome.
Jason, you coming on with us is great. We love the Gnome story because we're with you in the fact that these stories are all over the world, especially the little people stories, and whether you call them gnomes, elves, Puckwudgies, fairies, whatever. I mean, those are older stories than almost anything else.
They're older than every country in the world.
That's so right. To us, to us, these are stories that have a lot more credence than
Right.
some
Said,
of
hey, I
the-
saw the Slender Man.
Yeah, hey, I saw the Slender Man. So we appreciate you coming on and sharing with us and with our listeners some of these stories. And everybody go check out Jason's website, buy some of those books.
Buy that book, put it in your bathroom.
Put
I
it in your
guarantee
bathroom.
you.
That's right.
All right. Hey,
So-
guys, I really appreciate you having me on. This has been a lot of fun.
Yep. Thank you.
Thanks, Jason. Appreciate it.
All right. Have a good day.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of the From the Shadows podcast. Until next time, never shy away from the darkness or what may be lurking in the shadows. We are out.